Hello, friends. Welcome to another episode on Consulting Interview Prep with me, Nilay Bhatnagar. In this episode, we'll work with another example where we look at how to approach prioritization cases. If you remember, in the video I created on the framework to use for investment decision and prioritization cases, I said that the framework is very similar for both kinds of cases, and the only difference is the way you actually vocalize it. So for prioritization cases, you'll still look at the same areas, right? Financial impact, strategic impact, operational considerations, risks. But now hey, you're just creating a scorecard. You're comparing the options that you have based on the scorecard that you've created. And that scorecard has the financial, strategic, operational, and risk kind of dimensions to it, right? Okay, so now let's bring this to life with a real McKinsey case. You can find this on the McKinsey website. It's a very interesting case, a little off tangent. It's called Conservation Forever. So it's a NGO case, so not your typical for-profit case, right? And again, the way you should work with this particular video is I'll read out the prompt, you make your notes, jot down some clarifying questions. We'll quickly review a few clarifying questions. Then you should pause this video, take a couple of minutes, come up with your own approach, and then join me as I discuss the solution to the structure. Okay. All right. So let's dive right in. So our client is a non-profit organization called Conservation Forever. All right. It is known for its restoration and conservation efforts. Now, the degradation of nature is a major cause of the twin global climate and biodiversity crisis. Right? McKinsey does a lot of pro bono work to actually support nature conservation worldwide. And currently, we are working with CF, or Conservation Forever, which was formed in 2011. CF aims to permanently conserve large areas of land and ocean. Land use planning in these natural areas will be conducted in such a way that it considers biodiversity outcomes as a priority, right? This will require restoring natural habitats and ecosystems. Now, quickly, let's define what biodiversity really means. It's a variety of life at the genetic, species, or ecosystem level. So think of it as like the variety of species of plants, animals, or different organisms that are present or are naturally present in a particular region, right? Now, this natural biodiversity has a lot of intrinsic value, and it's also important for the well-being of human beings, right? Because it provides some essential things such as clean air. Because if you have trees and plants, they purify the air, they absorb the carbon dioxide, right? It provides food security, right? You can have fishing through ocean, sustainable fishing, right? You can have access to fresh water, rainwater harvesting, stuff like that, right? If you have good rainfall, even the land water fills up. Right? However, biodiversity is in severe decline, and this is putting its intrinsic value or the natural species and ecosystems at risk. And this has tremendous repercussions for the local communities, indigenous people, and actually even economies worldwide. Now, large-scale conservation efforts are quite complicated and challenging. They require significant upfront financing, dealing with complex legal frameworks in different countries, extensive coordination between multiple stakeholders such as civil societies, governments, NGOs, local communities, donors, etc. And so, due to the complexity and magnitude of these projects, initial screening of different options, a careful screening or scrutiny is extremely important, right? And therefore, our client, CF, has asked our help in prioritizing one out of the three areas that are currently under consideration by them for restoration and conservation efforts. These three areas include the coastal areas of Peru, the grasslands of Ukraine, and the mountain forests of Uganda. Right? So as I mentioned, your task is to help them prioritize which area out of these three should they choose. Okay. Let's talk about a few clarifying questions now. The first question is, what is the measure of success for CF, right? How do they consider any of these projects a success, right? Is it the impact on biodiversity, and how do they define that impact, right? Is it the impact on local population, the economy of the region, right? So we need to define, like, at least have a better idea of what does success mean for CF, right? Now we talked about three different. My second question is around, there are three different areas, right, that we talked about, and they look like very different areas, right? The coastal areas of Peru, you have grasslands, you have mountain forests. They probably have very, very different ecosystems, right? So I want to know what these three different areas are really known for, right, in terms of biodiversity, right? So that helps me understand what will be maximized in each of these areas and which might be more important for the client, right? And then finally, I just want to know quickly some constraints in terms of financing, access to talent, etc., that we should be mindful of, right? So now let's assume the answer to these questions is as follows. For the first question, they actually do not have a very clear criteria, and they're relying on McKinsey to help them define that, right? The answer to question number 2 is yes, you can assume coastal Peru is known more for like fishing, right? So more, what do you call that? Water-based or ocean protection, right? Mountain forests have a very, very different tropical kind of climate, right? So you're preserving a very, very rich biodiverse ecosystem, right? Rainforests have tremendous variety of trees, animals, and plants, right? And then the grasslands in Ukraine, right? They are known for a lot of different species of animals, right? Let's assume. Okay. So hopefully that helps you better understand a little bit about what different geographies are we talking about, right? All right. So now I would suggest that you actually pause this video and join me back once you have come up with your own approach. Okay. All right. So as I said, as we are thinking about how to prioritize these three different options or regions, we'll start with looking at the financial attractiveness, the strategic attractiveness, the operational attractiveness, and then key risks related to each of these areas. Right. So now let's dive into each of these buckets. So within the financial attractiveness, right, now, because this is a slightly different case, right, so there's no direct revenue stream for conservation forever as such, right? It's our client, but there might be some revenue streams associated with these projects and the kind of activities these projects undertake, right? For example, there could be local job creation, right? This could be through, for example, if you're conserving ocean areas, this could allow local people to fish and sell those fish sustainably, right? So it becomes a source of income for them, right? It could also help them create job opportunities, and actually the construction and the infrastructure build, right? So that might in turn boost the local economy because now they have more spending power, right? There could be tourism related to these areas. If they have not been developed properly, now we have the chance to actually make them sites known for tourism, right? If they are actually if tourism is actually viable. So we have to look at the appeal, the tourist appeal of these locations as well, right? And then moving on to the cost side, we'll have to look at the upfront investments for each of these locations that we'll have to make. Acquiring the land, the water that we are trying to conserve, like getting the permits, the licenses, all the infrastructure that we'll have to develop, etc. Right? And then of course there will be ongoing cost with the maintenance of facilities, the permanent staff that we hired, utilities, other supplies that would be needed to sustain these operations. Right? So I would love to compare the financial attractiveness of all these options based on these different dimensions that I just spoke about. Right? Moving on to a second bucket, we'll have to think about the strategic attractiveness of each of these options, right? Here, I would want to look at the impact that we'll have on biodiversity. All right. Without having like concrete definitions or a very good understanding of biodiversity, what I can say right now is maybe it's the number of plant and animal species that we are protecting. Maybe it's the total coverage area, right? How many hectares or acres of land or ocean are we able to protect? Right? So impact on biodiversity, right? The second thing that would make this attractive would be the geopolitical stability, right? We need to ensure that we are able to work with the local governments. They're not like a lot of upheavals and communal things that are going on in local communities that might make the execution of these projects quite difficult, right? And we would also require support from these local governments. We need to ensure that there's geopolitical stability in the region. And then finally, we have to ensure there's long-term alignment with our vision. Now, what is the potential of these options, the three regions that we're talking about in the future, right? Will this yield into more opportunities, right? Maybe there are more areas around coastal areas of Peru that we can help protect, right? So if there are more such areas in and around the areas that we're already talking about, that would increase the attractiveness, because assuming that if we were to next target those certain areas, the learning curve will be a lot less steeper and would make it easier for us to actually do those conservation efforts. Right? Moving on to a third bucket, operational attractiveness. Right? So first of all, we'll have to think about financing. Like, how are we going to finance these options? Will the same parties be financing, or will the parties change depending on the region in which we're dealing, and which region is more conducive to sourcing this financing quickly, right? Supply chain setup. How complicated would it be to actually set up your supply chain? Now, I can assume that we are probably talking about some remote areas. So how easy is it to get the supplies there? Does it have good network of roadways, right? What other means of transportation exist, right? Do we have good storage facilities, right? So we'll have to think about how complicated is the supply chain setup in all of these three options, right? Third would be, we'll have to think about ease of doing business in that particular region, right? We'll have to work with the local regulatory framework, right? And if the things are very bureaucratic, it might delay the timelines for us, right? So we would ideally want to work with areas or regions where the ease of doing business is pretty high, right? And how long will it take us to actually establish our operations and start these conservation efforts in these four areas, right? So that's how I'll actually compare these three different options based on the financial attractiveness, the strategic attractiveness, the operational attractiveness, right? And you can then also bake in some key risks, right? Region related risk could be local know-how, shift in governance. Operation related would be time and budget overruns, right? But the last bucket is not that important, right? As long as you have this clear scorecard that covers financial, strategic, and operational considerations, you should be able to come up with a very thorough way of evaluating three options and recommending which one should a client pursue, right? So hopefully now you're clear on how to actually go about solving these prioritization types of cases, right? There might be 2 options, there might be 3 options, there might be 5 options, but always think in terms of financial attractiveness, strategic attractiveness, and operational attractiveness, right? With that, it brings us to the end of this video. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, goodbye and take care.